Open your fridge and really look at what's inside. But the craving that makes you do it isn't a human invention at all. The yogurt is milk that soured on purpose. The cheese is milk that soured further, then ripened in mold. The beer and the wine are fruit and grains swarming with fungus. The bread rose because something alive was breathing in the dough. The pickles, the soy sauce, the coffee, the chocolate, the tang in a good sourdough, all of it is rot. Controlled, deliberate, delicious rot. You eat decay every single day, and you call it dinner. It's around 10 million years old, which means it started long before there was anything here human enough to have it. Let's clear away the obvious assumption first. We file fermentation under cooking, a cultural refinement, a clever thing that settled civilizations invented once they had spare grain and time on their hands. Breweries, wineries, artisan cheese. Wrong. And understanding why is the whole story. Fermentation is older than agriculture. It is older than pottery. It is older than the village. And the appetite driving its most famous product is older than our entire genus. To see how deep the roots go, you have to stop thinking about chefs and start thinking about enzymes. Start with the appetite itself. Around 10 million years ago, the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas was spending more and more time down on the forest floor. And the forest floor is where fruit goes to rot. Fruit that falls, splits, and sits in the warmth is fruit being colonized by wild yeast, which eats its sugar and breathes out alcohol. That fallen fruit is a free meal, but only if your body can handle the ethanol soaking through it. In 2015, a biologist named Matthew Kerrigan and his colleagues reconstructed an ancient digestive enzyme called ADH4, the first enzyme that touches alcohol as it enters your gut, and traced how it had changed across deep time. They found that right around 10 million years ago, a single tiny mutation, one swapped building block, made that enzyme roughly 40 times better at breaking down ethanol. And the timing was no accident. It lines up almost exactly with the moment our ancestors were coming down out of the safety of the trees and learning to feed on the ground, where the ripest, softest, most fermented fruit collects and waits. Publishing in the journal PLOS, they argued that our ancestors were adapting to eat fermented fruit long before any human brewed anything on purpose. This is the drunken monkey idea, first proposed by the biologist Robert Dudley. We cannot prove exactly why the mutation was favored, but the chemistry is not in doubt. The pull of that boozy, overripe smell is not a vice we picked up along the way. It is a foraging instinct 10 million years old, a nose tuned to find the calories that had already begun to rot. Now define the trick they were exploiting, because this is the heart of it. Fermentation is what happens when you let microbes eat your food before you do. But only the right microbes, in the right conditions, kept on a leash. Yeast and certain bacteria break down sugars and starches, and in the process they hand you 3 gifts. First, they predigest, unlocking calories and nutrients your own gut would struggle to reach, so a fermented food works like a second stomach running outside your body. Second, they preserve, flooding the food with alcohol and acids that kill off the dangerous rot, the bacteria that would otherwise poison you, so fermentation becomes a way to store summer's abundance deep into a starving winter. Third, they can detoxify, breaking down poisons and bitter compounds in plants you otherwise could not eat. Think of an olive straight off the branch, so bitter it is inedible, turned into food only by curing and fermenting that bitterness away. Or cassava, a root laced with natural cyanide that traditional fermentation leaches out and renders safe to swallow. Rot, aimed correctly, does not just preserve food. It creates food that could not exist any other way. Predigestion, preservation, protection. That is a technology, and you do not need farms or pottery to run it. You just need to understand rot well enough to point it in the direction you want, which is exactly what foragers were doing long before farming existed. Come north, to a 9,000-year-old settlement in Sweden called Norge Sunnensund, on the cold edge of the Baltic. There, the archaeologist Adam Boethius of Lund University excavated a long pit packed with the bones of fish, more than 200,000 of them. This was not a rubbish heap. It was a fermentation trench. The people had taken tons of fish, wrapped them without salt in pine bark, and probably seal and boar skins, packed them into the pit, and let them sour slowly in the cold soil, turning them into a sharp, preserved, edible store. Boethius reported it in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2016 as the earliest solid evidence of fermentation anywhere on Earth, around 9,200 years old. These were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, and the scale of it is staggering. Tons of fish processed in a single soured store, an operation closer to a food factory than a campfire. They were already running an industrial larder built entirely on controlled decay, banking calories against the long northern winter. And it forces us to see these people as planners and engineers, rather than as anyone scraping by from one meal to the next. Then, in a burial cave, we find the alcohol. Go to Raqefet Cave in Israel, in the hills near Haifa, where a people called the Natufians laid their dead to rest around 13,000 years ago. The Natufians were not farmers either, at least not yet. They were foragers who had begun to settle down. In 2018, the archaeologist Li Liu of Stanford University and her team studied the wear and residue inside stone mortars carved into the cave floor and found the microscopic signatures of brewing starch granules from wheat or barley that had been malted, mashed, and fermented into a thin, porridge-like beer. And they did not just find the residue. Liu's team reverse-engineered it, brewing their own small test batches from wild grain, then checking whether the microscopic damage in their starch matched the damage in the ancient stone. It did. This is, so far, the oldest evidence of alcohol made by human hands anywhere in the world, older than agriculture. And notice where it was found: a graveyard. The best reading is that this beer was brewed for ritual feasts to honor the dead, that the very first drink in the record was poured not for a casual evening, but for the living and the dead to share. Alcohol, from the beginning, was sacred before it was recreational. Which raises a genuinely heretical question. What if we have the whole story of civilization backwards? The textbook version says farming came first, that we domesticated grain to make bread, and beer was a lucky accident of the leftovers. But back in 1953, an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood posed a question that has haunted the field ever since. Did man, he asked, once live by beer alone? What if the desire to brew, and not the need for bread, was part of what first drove people to plant and tame wild grain? It sounds absurd until you visit Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the oldest monumental site on the planet. Carved stone pillars raised around 11,000 years ago by people who had not yet fully committed to farming. There, the archaeologist Oliver Dietrich and his colleagues found huge limestone vats, some holding up to 160 liters, and inside them, chemical traces consistent with fermented grain. The picture they paint is haunting. Hunter-gatherers gathering in their hundreds at a sacred place, hauling wild grain, brewing beer to fuel enormous feasts, the shared drinking and dancing that may have been the social glue holding those first great gatherings together. We cannot prove beer built the temple, but the logic holds, and it is unnerving. Maybe we did not settle down and then learn to brew. Maybe we settled down partly because we wanted to. Travel east, and the recipe grows richer. At a village called Jiahu, in Henan province in China, people were making something remarkable as far back as the 7th millennium before Christ, around 9,000 years ago. The molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern and his team analyzed residue soaked into pottery jars there and, publishing in PNAS in 2004, reconstructed the recipe, a fermented drink of rice, honey, and fruit, either hawthorn or wild grape. This is the oldest chemically confirmed fermented beverage in the world, and it is not a crude accident. It is a blended, deliberate recipe, ingredients balanced by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. The drink was so intriguing that a modern American brewery worked with McGovern to recreate it, which means you can, improbably, taste a 9,000-year-old ferment today. And the timing matters. This Chinese village was blending its brew at almost exactly the same moment that people in the Middle East were first fermenting barley and grapes. Two ends of a continent arriving at the very same idea, independently, that food and drink taste better and last longer when you let them rot just enough. And then there is wine and honey, which may be older still. Honey barely needs help to ferment. Dilute it with a little water, let wild yeast find it, and it turns into mead, which many suspect was humanity's first alcohol, even though sugar leaves almost no trace for us to find. Grapes tell a clearer story. That same Patrick McGovern chased wine's origin across the Near East, At Haji Firuz Tepe in Iran, he identified wine residue in jars around 7,400 years old, sealed with resin from the terebinth tree as a preservative. Then, publishing again in PNAS in 2017, his team pushed the date back further, to the country of Georgia in the Caucasus, where villagers were fermenting grapes in great buried jars around 8,000 years ago, leaving tartaric acid, the chemical fingerprint of the grape, soaked into the clay. Beer, mead, wine, fish, milk, grain, everywhere you look in the deep past, humans were striking an alliance with the microbes that eat our food. And that is the reframe that changes everything. We think we invented fermentation, one more clever human craft. Flip it around. Fermentation invented part of us. The taste came first, 10 million years ago, written into an enzyme before we had hands to brew with. The technique came before farming, before the wheel, before the written word. And the hunger for the ferment may have helped pull us out of our wandering and into villages, into fields, into the first temples. It is not that civilization sat down and produced beer. Beer may have helped produce civilization. Go deeper still, and fermentation is the strangest domestication we ever pulled off. We tamed the wolf into the dog, the wild grass into wheat, the aurochs into the cow. But before any of that, we tamed rot itself. We took decay, the one force that destroys every food we have ever had, the thing that would strip the meat and spoil the grain right out from under us. And we made it work for us instead. That is not spoilage. That is the oldest domestication of all, an alliance with the invisible. Lay it out. 10 million years ago, a mutation in an enzyme lets our ape ancestors safely eat fermenting fruit. 9,200 years ago, foragers in Sweden bury tons of fish to sour in a pit. 13,000 years ago, Natufians brew beer for the dead at Rockafet Cave. 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers may be brewing to feast at Göbekli Tepe. 9,000 years ago, a village in China perfects a recipe of rice, honey, and fruit. 8,000 years ago, Georgians fill buried jars with the world's first wine. A single trick, controlled rot, running from before we were human all the way to the glass in your hand. So the next time you sip a beer, or bite into cheese, or catch that clean sour edge in real sourdough, understand what you are actually doing. You are following a craving that is 10 million years old, using a technology older than the plow, and shaking hands with the same microbes your ancestors befriended before they ever planted a seed. Every fermented thing you love is a small, safe, delicious act of rot, held exactly on the edge where decay becomes food instead of poison. You were never just eating. You were finishing a bargain your species struck with the invisible world a very, very long time ago. All the research is linked in the description.